Today, we'll be installing the MadJax King XD lift kit for an E-Z-Go TXT. Using a lifter jack, lift the E-Z-Go TXT for easy access to the underside of the vehicle. Ensure it's secured and stable before beginning any work. First, remove the wheels and tires using an impact driver. Next, remove the dust caps from the wheel bearings using a chisel and a hammer. Remove the cotter pin holding the castle nut in place using a pliers and a hammer. To remove the castle nut, use a 1.5-inch socket and ratchet. Remove the wheel bearing from the spindle. Repeat these steps on the other side. Using a 5/8 socket and ratchet, remove the nut and bolt that's holding the track bar. Repeat on the other side. You might have to use a mallet to loosen the bolt or a ball joint removal tool. Remove the track bar. Next, remove the cotter pin. Then, remove the castle nut from the tie rod using an 11/16 socket. With the castle nut gone, remove the tie rod. Remove the nut and bolt that is keeping the spindle attached using a 3/4-inch socket, wrench, and ratchet. Remove the spindle and then repeat on the other side. Using a T30 Torx bit, remove the 3 bumper bolts, one on each side and one on the bottom, holding in the front bumper. Using a 5/8 socket, ratchet, and wrench, remove the 2 bolts on top, holding the front bumper bracket. Next, drill out the rivets and remove the passenger side rocker panel to gain access to the 3 bolts underneath the floor mat. Using a 5/8 socket, ratchet, and wrench, remove the 3 bottom bolts that are holding the front bumper bracket in place. These are the middle 3 sets of bolts under the floor mat. Remove each bolt and remove the front bumper bracket. Remove the nut holding the steering shaft using a 13mm socket and ratchet. Using a 5/8 socket and wrench, remove the 3 bolts holding the steering rack in place. Next, remove the leaf spring bracket bolts with a 5/8 socket and ratchet. Repeat this for both sides. Using 11/16 wrench and a 5/8 wrench, remove the nut that was keeping the steering rack in place. Using a 9/16 wrench, remove the lower shock bolts. Keep in mind that you'll be reusing the OEM shocks and hardware. Once these are removed, remove the front cross member. Using 5/8 socket and ratchet, remove the bolts that are attached to the leaf springs underneath the floor mat. Remove the leaf springs and repeat on the other side. Using a 9/16 wrench, remove the upper bolts holding the shocks. Remove the shocks. Retain the shocks and hardware for later use. Take the M10 by 60mm bolt with the M10 washer and insert them into the previous leaf spring mounting holes. 3 on the driver's side and then 3 on the passenger side. An extra person is recommended for this step. Lift the passenger side frame rail into the middle leaf spring bolt. Install the bracket, M10 washers, and nuts. Tighten until snug. You'll come back to fully tighten these later. Using a 1/2-inch socket and ratchet, loosen the silver bolt that's behind the brake pedal assembly to the frame. This is located behind the 3 leaf spring bolts on the driver's side. This will give you clearance when installing the driver's side frame rail. Repeat these same steps on the driver's side, but make note that you'll have to maneuver around the brake pedal assembly as shown. Uniformly tighten each M10 bolt to a snug position using a 17mm socket, ratchet, and wrench. Align the steering rack on the driver's side frame rail. Using M12 by 45mm bolts, secure to the frame rail using an M12 lock nut. Use a 19mm socket, ratchet, and wrench to tighten steering assembly onto the rail. Grab the driver's side frame rail support and using the M10 by 120mm bolts and washers, drop them into the frame rail to hold it in place. Using the retained hardware from the front leaf spring brackets, slide the spacer plate in between the frame rail support. Thread the bolt in from the top of where the OEM shocks were using a 16mm ratchet and socket. Repeat on the passenger side frame rail support. Install upper shock mounting plate to the vertical frame rail supports using an M10 by 45mm bolts and washers. Secure loosely with M10 nuts and washers. Keep in mind that you might need to remove some of these bolts to get shocks in later. Remove both front M10 by 120mm bolts in order to place the upper control arm bracket onto the frame rail supports. Then reinstall the bolts through the brackets. Grab and line up the lift suspension subframe into the 4 M10 by 120mm bolts. You'll need an extra person or a floor jack to assist in this process. Using M10 nuts and washers, secure the bolts that are through the lift suspension subframe and bracket with a 14mm ratchet, socket, and a 17mm wrench. Remove the steering rack assembly in order to install the U-joint steering shaft onto the assembly. Reinstall the steering rack assembly. Slide upper control arms into place on the bracket. If fitment is tight, try sliding in at an angle from the side to get it started, and then wiggle into place. Note the orientation of driver's side versus passenger side. Ensure the shock mount is bent towards the back. Using the M10 by 120mm bolt, thread it through the upper A-arm. Secure bolt with a nut and washer. Repeat this on the other side. Grab the driver's side spindle and, using an M10 by 75mm bolt, attach the spindle onto upper and lower control arms. Repeat this process on the other side. Install tie rod onto passenger side spindle. Reusing the factory castle nut and new cotter pin, secure the tie rod onto the spindle. Next, grab the center tie rod and bolt it on the spindles. With everything loosely bolted and connected, secure the bolts and nuts with a ratchet and socket. Grab the factory shock and put it in the upper bracket shock hole. Secure with the retained factory hardware. Undo the upper control arm bolt in order to swivel the lower shock bolt into place. Secure top and bottom shock bolts into place. Repeat this on the other side. Securely tighten control arm bolts on both sides. Next, remove the spindle covers and install the spindle hub on the passenger side. Secure the castle nut with a 1.5 inch socket and ratchet. Install a cotter pin on the castle nut and reinstall your dust cap. Repeat this on the other side. Next, remount your tires and wheels. Now, let's turn it over to Cody for the rear installation.
Now that we have our front tires attached, we're moving on to the back of the lift. When installing your rear lift kit, you may have to remove the brake cable from the brake cable anchor to give yourself more slack. You'll see that we removed our factory tires. We've also placed the cart up on jack stands and blocked the front wheels. To get started, we're going to remove the spring plate bolts at the front and the back of the spring. The shock, we're going to just loosen the nut. You don't want to take it completely off, as well as the U-bolts. We're going to loosen those nuts all the way to the end, but do not remove them. This is going to help hold the motor in place. Be sure to retain your spring hardware. Now that we have everything loosened, we can now install the driver's side block. Now that we're on the driver's side, you'll notice that we have supported the rear axle with a lift. This is to keep it in place, because as soon as you start loosening up these bolts, the motor's going to want to fall out or move. You may have to loosen up the brake cable on the driver's side as well. Refer to your manufacturer's instructions on how to do this. So we're going to do the same thing we did on the passenger side. We're going to remove the spring bolts. Going to fully remove the U-bolts and the shock bolt on this side. You do not have to retain the U-bolts, but you do want to retain the shock nut as well as the spring bolts. Now that we have all of our factory hardware removed, we're going to reattach our spring above the rear axle using the retained hardware. Make sure that both bolts are in place before you tighten. Now before we put our blocks on, I want to explain the spacer to you. The spacer has to do with the rear spring. If your spring has more than 2 leaves in it, then you don't need a spacer. If it has 2, then you'll put the spacer on top of the rear block. Now we're going to put our rear block in. You'll notice the hole on the top of the rear block. This goes on the nut that's under the bottom of your springs. Just going to place that on top of your axle and use your lift to put your axle in place and line up your nut with your hole on top of your block. Now that we have our rear block lined up with our spring, we're going to attach our rear bracket. You'll notice on the bracket that the tab that comes off the edge needs to be towards the inside of the cart. This is where your shock will mount. Also, you'll notice that the tab has an angle pointing up. This is the driver's side. Set it on top of the bolt, on top of your spring, pull your shock down, and reattach it with the hardware we retained from earlier. You don't want to fully tighten up the shock, just where it holds it in place. Now we're going to install our U-bolts through the top of our bracket, through our block into the bottom of our axle. Once both U-bolts are in place, you can use the hardware provided in your kit and tighten the U-bolts. Now that we have our U-bolts in place, we're going to move on to the passenger side. Now that we have our driver's side block installed, we're going to go ahead and remove the shock bolt as well as the U-bolts and put our spring on top of the rear axle. Now we're going to put our spring on top of our rear axle, just like we did on the driver's side. We're going to drop our lift down a little bit. And reattach our spring using the retained hardware. Now we're ready to install our rear block. Again, you want to be sure that your nut on the bottom of your spring lines up with the hole on top of your block. Once that's accomplished, we're going to take our rear bracket. Now you want to pull your shock down through your tab on your bracket and reinstall your shock hardware that we retained from earlier. You can tighten this hardware once your U-bolts are in place. Just like we did on the driver's side, you want to take your U-bolts down through the top of your bracket. Once both bolts are in place, then you can use your supplied hardware to tighten your U-bolts.